Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Blanchard. I'm the former chair of the National Archives Foundation. Thank you. Yes. Our current chair couldn't be here, Secretary Rodney Slater, but he sends his very, very best wishes. We have an exciting program for you. I would like, though, because this is hosted by the National Archives Foundation, for our board members to please stand. Some of you are here. All right. All right. I should also say that before I introduce our main event here, and we do have a very special evening for you, we do have a relatively new member of Congress from Rhode Island, Congressman Gabe Amo. Gabe, where are you? Thank you for coming. Rhode Island. And you know, an old friend of ours who runs the White House Historical Association is here, Stuart McLaurin. Stuart, thank you for your leadership. Now, our Archives Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Archives, and we exist to help the archives, to provide resources for programs, exhibitions, exhibits, to do everything we can to promote the understanding and appreciation of the American experience, including authors and others. As you may have read, there are over 13.5 billion documents housed in the archives in our vast holdings. And as I said, we support programming for the archives. Tonight, we have an exciting program with David Rubenstein, who's going to be interviewed by author Doug Brinkley. Let me simply mention that Doug Brinkley, you may know, is an award-winning author. He's written many, many books. He's a member of our foundation board of directors, I might add. He's a professor of history at Rice University. He's a historian at the New York Historical Society, presidential historian, trustee of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and a contributing editor of Vanity Fair. Now, David Rubenstein is a man that's of all seasons. He's done almost everything. Many of you know, you may not know actually, 3 years out of law school at 27 years old, David Rubenstein was Deputy Director of Domestic Policy for President Carter. I actually met him then as a young member of Congress. He was a right-hand man also to Stuart Eisenstat, who many of you know. And Stuart, of course, is still very active, as is David Rubenstein. David has been chairman and co-founder of the Carlyle Group. But more importantly for our purposes, he has supported, he has kind of invented, and is a personification of what we call patriotic philanthropy. He has supported and helped virtually every cultural institution in this Washington, D.C. community. Not, yes. I mean, all of the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. I mean, you can't name anything that he hasn't blessed with his support and leadership, including restoring the Lincoln Memorial, restoring Monticello, Montpelier, the university he attended, Duke, at Chicago Law School. He's helped everyone everywhere. There is no one who's done more for promoting and sharing and preserving and protecting the American experience that I know of anywhere than David Rubenstein. I just want to underscore that. You know, we have a Records of Rights exhibition here, exhibit here, down below here, that's really great. And that was a gift, again, from David Rubenstein. I encourage you to tour that, to visit that at some point when you're in the archives. He also bought an original copy of the Magna Carta, and of course, loaned it to us as well. So, and then lately he decided he would own the Baltimore Orioles, so he's now the owner of the Orioles. So I want to introduce, so it's my pleasure to introduce Doug Brinkley, our friend and board member, author, and David M. Rubenstein. Gentlemen, come forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know there were that many Baltimore Oriole fans. And
Kennedy Center fans. Maybe.
yeah, okay. David, thank you. And everything that was just said by the governor's true. Your philanthropy and what you do to remind us of our American presidents and institutions is just so admirable. And we're going to talk tonight about David's book, The Highest Calling, which gives us a chance to look at the presidency writ large. And I wanted to, we were backstage, and I do notice, because you mentioned them in your book, people ask you some about Ted Sorensen, John F. Kennedy, your coming of age. Let me start with Kennedy. What did that inaugural mean to you growing up, in the ask not, in the sense of public, service?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, and when John Kennedy was running for president, he was going to a fundraiser. He hadn't yet been elected. Going to a fundraiser, which was near an armory near my house. And so I knew he was going to be there, so I went out to the street, and I saw him drive by, and I waved, and I figured he saw me there, and he waved back. I don't know if he really recognized me or not. But when he was inaugurated, it was a holiday. I don't know if any of you remember this, but it was a holiday in that day. And then I watched on TV, black and white television. And then the next day, my sixth grade teacher had copies of the speech, and she went through it with us line by line. And I didn't quite realize how unique that speech was and how great it was, because I was relatively young. But it just stuck with me that there were lines in there that were so great. And when you compare that speech with other great speeches, it has many things in common. Great speeches like Martin Luther King's speech in the Civil Rights March in August of '63, or Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, they don't actually say, I'm going to do something specific. They don't mention legislation. They don't have a laundry list of all the great things they're going to do. It's more uplifting, and that's what Kennedy's speech had. And it was a speech that just stayed with me, and obviously I remembered after reading more about it who the author really was. It was a combination thing. And John Kennedy, because he had been criticized for not being an intellectual heavyweight, and because he was criticized for not having written the Profiles in Courage, he really wanted to make sure that people thought he was an intellectual heavyweight. So he really wanted people to, and he was a pretty smart guy, but he didn't have the time to write a speech. And so he delegated it to his intellectual blood bank, Ted Sorensen. Sorensen was, at the time, about 31 years old, and a really gifted speechwriter, maybe the greatest presidential speechwriter ever. And the draft went back and forth, and Kennedy marked up things on it, but he really wanted people to know that he had written it. And he'd gotten an idea from FDR. FDR had the same problem. People didn't think he was an intellectual heavyweight. So he had a professor at Columbia write the speech, really. His name was Raymond Moley. Yeah. And FDR then took the draft that had been done by Moley, it was typed up, and he wrote it out in his handwriting. And so he later was able to sell it, or it was sold by somebody for $100,000. And Kennedy mentioned that to Sorensen at one point. So what happens is, Kennedy deserves some credit for the speech. And as Sorensen would always say, the person who gives the speech is the person who deserves the blame or the credit, because somebody has to give the speech. And so Kennedy's view was that he gave the speech. Sorensen's view, he gave the speech. So Sorensen always tried to make it clear that Kennedy was deserving of credit for these speeches. But to make sure he got a little bit more credit than maybe he would otherwise get, when he was flying back from Palm Beach during the transition with 3 days to go before the inauguration, Kennedy calls back Hugh Sidey. Hugh Sidey's on the plane, the Caroline. Hugh Sidey is called back by the president, or president-elect, and said, Hugh, I'm working on my speech. What do you think of this draft? And Hugh Sidey's saying to himself, wait a second, he's being inaugurated in 3 days. His speech isn't ready yet, and he's asking me, a journalist, what I think? Well, what happened is he already had the speech done, but he wrote it out in his handwriting, as FDR had done. He showed a few pages to Sidey, and Sidey then wrote, I know he wrote it because I saw it in his own handwriting. And those pages are actually now at the Kennedy Library. I was at the Kennedy Library a couple weeks ago, and they actually have those pages there. So anyway, Sorensen was a very, very gifted writer, I think the greatest presidential speechwriter we've ever seen. And it is interesting that today, nobody would suggest that a president has to write his speeches to be considered really smart or something. Presidents don't have time to do it anymore. But in those days, presidents used to be thought that they should be writing their own speeches, and so Kennedy was in that mold.
You know, I teach at Rice University, as you know, and that's where Kennedy gave the moonshot speech, as it's called now. And if you look at those original drafts, you'll see it's Sorensen's the principal architect of the speech, but Kennedy would handwrite in the little humor bits that comes only from being a good politician, like, you know, why do we go to the moon? Why does Rice bother to play, you know, University of Texas in football? Because it's a challenge, you know. And it's fun, like what David just did, to go look at those speeches, what the archives here provides for people to look at some of those and see how the president puts their own imprimatur on it.
That was a famous speech because, as you know, Kennedy had given a speech to Congress talking about the importance of going to the moon, but didn't get that much attention. You've written a whole book about that subject. But as I recall, when he gave the actual speech that got more attention at Rice University, he said, and with this moonshot, and with what you're doing here at the Kennedy Space Center, or not called it was the Johnson Space Center then, or later called the Johnson Space Center, this will be the biggest payroll ever to go in history up to the moon, or something like that. And he caught himself and said, I meant to say biggest payload. But then he said, well, actually, it also will be the biggest payroll.
That's right. And even there's a letter from George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the head of the Republican Party of Harris County, Texas. And in the letter, he's telling Republicans when JFK shows up, let's be really nice to him because of all the money that he's brought to Houston. We don't want to be, you know, we owe him a lot for developing that area.
And remember, in those days, as a young boy, I watched television. You know, I remember vaguely seeing Dwight Eisenhower. And I thought, wow, this is an old-looking man, old. How old was he when he was elected president? 62. We loved our president only 62. He left when he was 70, and we haven't had a president that young in a long time, right? But remember, John Kennedy was elected at 43 years old. 43. It's just hard to believe anybody could be that young and be president.
And if you go back in now, you realize that Churchill, de Gaulle, Eisenhower, the whole list of them of World War II, they're all born in the 19th century. Right. And so Kennedy's a 20th century jet age, young, vigorous, young, president. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that Kennedy had lived in England because his father had been ambassador. And he did meet Churchill during the war, and he really admired him. But what Churchill tried to do was always have a signature line in the speech, something to be the memorable part. And Kennedy tried to replicate that, and ask not what your country can do for you was his signature line. Many people think that Churchill thought of these wonderful lines on the top of his head, but actually people said he spent months working on his spontaneous lines.
Yeah.
He was a quick wit, but not quite as quick as some of his lines would suggest, and he worked on these lines, and at the right moment he'd come forward with them.
You know, I'm told when Hemingway was in Paris, he would struggle on these stories, short stories, for weeks, just killing himself, months even. And then when he'd go to the cafe, he'd tell people he wrote it in a day. Right. You know, it's just like, oh.
Like two of my favorite Churchill lines I can't resist. Churchill, when he's former prime minister, he was prime minister initially at 65, and then he became prime minister again, I think he was about 80. He came to Washington and the Virginia area, I should say, in Richmond, after he had been prime minister the second time. And he was a little bit older, not too old to be president of the United States, of course, but he was a little older. And so he's in a line to get some food, and the dowager hostess says, well, Mr. Prime Minister, can I help you get your food? He said, well, okay. And she said, well, you have a buffet line. And she said, what would you like? He said, I'd like some of that chicken breast. Oh, Mr. Prime Minister, in mixed company, we don't use the word breast. That's white meat, okay? So the next day, he sends her a telegram with a corsage in it. And it says, thank you for the wonderful, wonderful time. Please put this on your white meat. The other one was, one time, he's the leader of the Conservative Party. And he is in the House of Commons, and the leader of the Socialist Party is Clement Attlee. So Churchill goes to the restroom, and he's standing in front of the urinal. And in comes Clement Attlee. So Churchill quickly zips up and walks away. And Attlee says, "What's the matter? You're embarrassed to stand next to the leader of the Labor Party?" He said, "Well, that's not the problem. It's just that you see anything big, you want to nationalize it." I got that from John Major.
Did you? Oh,
Okay.
that's a great. What about just while we're on Churchill? Why not? How important was FDR and Churchill's friendship when you go through? They wrote each other all the time, Atlantic Charter and onwards.
I would say Churchill was trying to get FDR in the war, and obviously we're somewhat isolationist at the time. And Churchill ran for re-election in 1940, saying his slogan was, "I kept us out of the war. I kept us out of the war." And because it was very important to stay out of the war. And he was, from occasionally, was doing some things to help the British with Lend-Lease and other things. But Churchill tried to befriend him many times. And he never quite got Roosevelt to say, "I want to go into the war." But after Pearl Harbor, we did go into the war, in part because after Pearl Harbor, 2 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States, which may have been a mistake. But that's when we went into the war, really against Germany. Churchill used to come and stay at the White House, and I believe he stayed in the White House 3 different times. And he had a habit, of taking baths and getting out of the bathtub and maybe not completely clothing himself for a while. And then sometimes he'd wander around the White House. And one time he's naked and getting out of the bathtub, and in rolls FDR, and Churchill's. And FDR sees him naked. He says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll come back later." He said, No. The Prime Minister of England has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." But the real reason we have Blair House is because Mrs. Roosevelt got tired of this guy staying there all the time. And so she basically importuned her husband to find a place where foreign dignitaries could stay. And so that's why they bought Blair House.
How important do you think Churchill's coming to America in 1946 to Fulton, Missouri, what is now Truman State, giving that famous Iron Curtain speech, did that add fortitude to Truman's Cold War policy and containment?
For those who don't know about this speech, it was maybe one of the most famous speeches of its time. And I was invited to give an annual speech at the same place in the same lectern and a few years ago, and because a member of my board is a graduate of that school. It's a little college in Missouri, Westminster College. And a man who knew Truman was a graduate of that school. And when Truman became president, this man went in to see a friend of his at the White House from Missouri. And this man, who was the Westminster College, I think he might have been chairman of the board, he said to his friend, "Well, we want to invite Churchill to make a speech at Westminster College," which nobody had really heard of. This is after World War II, of course. Truman's president at that time. And this guy said to the person from Westminster College, "Let's go talk to the boss." So they go into the Oval Office and they explain the situation. And Truman says, "Well, give me the letter you're going to send to Churchill." And he writes a handwritten thing. "If you come to make the speech, I will travel with you and I'll be there when you make the speech." So, if you're Churchill and you want to get to know Truman, Churchill gets it. He said it's okay. So he comes over to the United States. And then they take the train to Westminster College. And in the train ride, they're playing poker. And Churchill loses all his money, basically. And so Truman is saying to his colleagues, "Look, he doesn't know how to play poker. We got to make him, we got to give him some money back. So don't be so good in beating him in poker." And then Churchill gives a speech where he uses the famous phrase that an Iron Curtain is descending upon Europe. And that phrase became, symbolic of what the problem was in Eastern Europe. And Churchill was really a gifted speech maker. He wrote a lot of these speeches himself, and he really practiced them. Which is, some days you get people now making speeches that they just see a minute before. And I'll tell you, another great speech, Ronald Reagan gave a great speech. He was a good speech maker. But one of my favorite other presidential speechwriters is Peggy Noonan. Some of you have obviously heard of her. She writes a column now at the Wall Street Journal. She had been working for Dan Rather. And so she gets hired to work in the White House as a presidential speechwriter. And as you all may know, if you know presidential speechwriting these days, Generally, the speechwriters are in the executive office building, and they get to see the president rarely. They do a lot of it sending back and forth. And occasionally, the president might call him over, but generally, unless you've got a relationship like Kennedy had with Sorensen, you're really going to be seeing the president that much. And she was brand new. And so she got the assignment of writing a speech that Reagan was going to give at the 40th anniversary of D-Day, the Pointe du Hoc speech. She had never met the man. She goes over to Pointe du Hoc, talks to the veterans that are going to be there. She writes this incredible speech, and one of the best speeches a president's ever given, one of the best Reagan ever gave. And she had never met him. And she hadn't met him even after he gave the speech. She wasn't invited to go on the trip. She wrote the speech, turned it in, and Reagan read it. And I asked her, asking her recently, I was looking at a tape of the speech, and I said, Reagan, wasn't reading a teleprompter. He had little cards, like note cards. And he's, without missing a beat, he's just flipping over the cards and doesn't say or anything. He just flips them over, and it was just like a perfect speech. And it was an incredible speech. And the idea that you could write a great speech like that and never meet the person that gave it is amazing.
It is amazing. And one of the most amazing documents I've seen in the Presidential Library is I actually edited them as a little book called The Notes. But Ronald Reagan kept just old library, filings of jokes, each one on any topic, Boston, hot dogs, your cats, it could be anything, but he had them in alphabetical order, and depending on the evening, before he would go out, he would, or on a travel trip, pull those note cards and then just insert the joke in there. And it's amazing how it worked, because it wasn't no longer just a policy speech. He got a couple laughs, like we've got a couple tonight. It made it a little bit more levity.
Reagan relied on those cards a bit, and there was a story in the beginning of the administration. He has a meeting with the congressional leaders, and he's reading a new card that had been prepared by staff, and it says, say to Tip O'Neill such and such. And he was reading the directions as opposed to what he was supposed to say. And actually, he had met Tip O'Neill earlier, and right after he was elected president, he comes to Washington, and he goes out to meet Tip O'Neill, and Tip O'Neill says, Mr. President, this is the desk of Grover Cleveland. And Reagan says, I played him in a movie. So no, that was Grover Cleveland Alexander, the pitcher. Now, this is the president. Anyway, Reagan had a good sense of humor. Jim Baker, who was in my firm for many years after he left the government, used to say, he would go into Reagan every morning, and he would say, boys, what are we going to do today? Reagan would say that because he was like John Sears had described him as an actor. You give him the script, and he was great, but he didn't say, here's what I want to do today. Tell me what we're doing today, and he went through the parts, and he was obviously very successful in that.
I've never asked you this, but why the sunny optimism in FDR and Reagan? How do they do that, where they get themselves in a good mood for the day? You don't find them often belittling people or,
it's, in Roosevelt's case, he had a sunny disposition. He was not thought to be that smart as a young man. He was thought to be a bit effete. He was an only child, more or less. His father died when he was relatively young, and he basically became a mama's boy. In fact, he was such a mama's boy that when he finally got married to Eleanor Roosevelt, his mother, Sarah, gave him a gift. The gift was a house in New York. But she bought the house next door and carved a door in between, so she would go back and forth between the two houses. It wasn't, she wasn't really letting him go. He had a sunny disposition. He was always kind of smiling, and maybe it was to put up for the fact that he was afflicted. The book that I refer to in here was written by Dick Darman's son, Jonathan Darman, says that had Roosevelt not gotten polio, he might not have had the grit and determination that propelled him forward. He was an easygoing guy. Nobody ever thought he was an intellectual genius, all that hard-driven. But he came down with illness, and for 30 days, they didn't really get a real doctor in. And for 30 days, polio, in effect, took over his legs. Had he gotten a doctor early who knew what was going on, it was said that maybe they could have modulated the polio. He then spent the rest of his life thinking he could learn how to walk again, but he never could. He faked walking a bit, but he never really could walk again. In the case of Reagan had a sunny disposition, and it's interesting. His father was an alcoholic, and he had to pick up his father sometimes in the snow. He was drunk, and he had to pick him up, take him home. Somehow, he just developed this sunny disposition that he never disliked almost anybody. And he just was an easygoing person. Sometimes people get to the White House and they have, Nixon is a good example. He had a lot of attributes that we would say wouldn't be so wonderful and not exactly a sunny disposition. They both shared alcoholic fathers, though. Yeah. Both of them had alcoholic fathers. It's interesting how many people get to be president and don't really know their father. So Barack Obama met his father once. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And Nixon's father was more or less an alcoholic and not very successful. Reagan's father was an alcoholic. Roosevelt's father died when Roosevelt was relatively young. Bill Clinton's father died before Bill Clinton was born. And you just never know how these things are going to play out and how the child's going to grow up. One time at the Kennedy Center Honors at the White House, we were honoring Dave Brubeck. He was a great jazz pianist. And Obama gave a story that you can't get a speechwriter right. He made it up, kind of from his life, and his story was incredible and brought tears to everybody's eyes. He said, I only met my father once in my life. He was not really around. He came to visit me when I was in Hawaii at the age of 10. And he said, I want to take you, I'm not going to be in your life. I'm living in Africa. But I want to teach you something you should know, and it's jazz. And tonight, we're going to go to a concert by Dave Brubeck. And Obama said, the only time I can remember my father was when I saw him with Dave Brubeck, who I'm now meeting for the first time.
Wow. That's an amazing story. And Bill Clinton, I've had a chance to interview him some at Chappaqua, and he collects saxophones from around the world. And Brubeck was this massive influence on him also with but let me close up something on Churchill. In your book, you have a chapter on George W. Bush, which I didn't realize till I read your book that George W. Bush started painting because Churchill painted. What's the backstory to
George
that?
W., and if anybody wants to know why his name is George W. Bush and not George H.W. Bush, this is the answer. I asked George H.W. Bush once, why didn't you name your son Junior? He said, because when I was a little boy growing up in Greenwich, people made fun of me. I had two middle names, and people always made fun of me, and I swore that if I had a son, I wouldn't give him that affliction. George W. Bush told me, I got bored after being president. I didn't want to be involved in policy anymore, and I basically got bored. And so he read a book that Churchill had written about the joys of painting, and he said, well, if Churchill can do it, I can do it. Now, I don't know why he compared himself to Churchill, but and he did. I mean, he paints, and he paints 6 hours a day. He loves it. He painted a picture of me, sent it to me.
Really?
It doesn't look that much like me, but it was very nice, and I have it somewhere. But I mean, he gets a lot of pleasure out of it, and a lot of people do that. And a number of presidents. Eisenhower was a painter as well, and so Prince Charles, or King Charles now, is a big painter too, so it happens. So let me ask you a question.
Carter too. Carter would paint.
Carter did everything. Wood cutting, painting, poetry. There was nothing that Carter didn't do. He did everything. So now you interviewed Carter once for about his post-presidency. And I think the year you interviewed him was, 1987 or something like that?
90, yeah, in the 90s.
Okay. But he lived another, 30 years afterwards, so you kind of got there early. So what was your impression of Carter as a person who was out of office, humiliated when he lost to Reagan, and had he reconciled with the fact that he wasn't going to be considered one of the great presidents, but that his post-presidency was really going to make him more famous?
Yes, I think there's a legacy piece to it, but he got back to Plains, Georgia broke. I mean, really broke. And he was a bit depressed, and he fell upon the idea of the Carter Center in a genuine way when Anwar Sadat was murdered, because Carter, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or however you feel about the Carter years, it's an indisputable big moment that he got the Camp David Accords done, Menachem Begum of Israel and Anwar Sadat, and that Sadat gave his life to peace. Carter started thinking, I can continue giving my life as a peacemaker, and that idea fit very nicely with his human rights side, and it fit with his Southern Baptist religious leanings. And as you know, I mean, he worked tirelessly. He was a good person to donate money to because he was so frugal. Like if you were, he would stay at the Marriott, the cheapest room at the Marriott Garden Inn on the outskirts. Different than other presidents who want to be at the, want a whole suite, want all this. He was very humble on his needs of circumstance.
When he was staying at the Garden Inn or wherever he might be staying, that was a step up. When he was running for president the first time, he would stay in people's homes.
Yes.
Not because he really wanted to stay there, but it was cheap. He couldn't afford anything else. I'll tell you one interesting thing that people forget about Sadat and Carter is that obviously Sadat was killed clearly because of the Camp David Accords. And so President Reagan asked Carter and Ford and Nixon, the three living ex-presidents, to go to represent the United States at the funeral. And they were going over on a plane that was the Secretary of State's plane, Al Haig. And so it was a very awkward situation. You got three presidents, and Rosalind Carter was there as well, and Al Haig it was his plane. So he took the cabin with the bed, and he had the three presidents sit in a cabin where there was no bed. And, but interestingly, when they came back, Nixon peeled off and went to Europe, and Ford and Carter had 8, 9, 10 hours together, and that's when they bonded. They had run against each other, didn't really like each other, particularly when they campaigned, but they spent so many hours together, they realized they had a lot in common. They actually became really good friends, and they did a lot of things together, which is, an interesting thing. Many times, ex-presidents don't really get along with each other, and usually they only see each other at presidential funerals or at library dedications for presidents. That's usually the only time they meet.
They became extraordinarily close, Carter and Ford, genuine, deep friendship. And it might be a segue to bring us back earlier into your book in thinking about John Adams and Jefferson era. They ran against each other beyond being founders and all that we know. But in 1800, they ran against each other just at loggerheads. But then later in life, they became correspondence.
Right.
What was that about? And they weren't friends like Carter, Ford, but nevertheless they were.
It was different. It was what happened was this: when the Constitution, when the Declaration of Independence was being conceived of, Adams was the big deal at the Second Continental Congress, and he was the one really saying we got to break away, and he had a motion to do that, and they had to go back to the states to get the colonies to get approval for it. And during that interim period of time, it was said that they have to have a justification for breaking away if they do vote to break away. They had a committee of 5 people to draft a Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the youngest, thought to be a good writer. So they gave him the assignment, you write the Declaration of Independence, or whatever it was then called. And Jefferson had 18 days to do it. He did it in the last 3 days. Like anybody else, he put it off, he had other things to do. And then he wrote what today would be considered something that would be plagiarized, because he didn't say it was an original, he was just taking the thoughts of people in that era. And he turned it in, and Franklin edited it a little bit. Originally it had said, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And Jefferson, and it was edited a little bit. But when they actually came back and they voted to be independent on the night of July the 2nd, they then took up on the night of July the 2nd the document that Jefferson had largely written himself, and they made about 60 changes in it. And Jefferson was furious because he didn't talk in public. He only gave one public speech. That was his first inaugural address. He had a high, squeaky voice, very great writer, but not a good public speaker. So he sat there the entire time, and Franklin's consoling him, saying, don't worry, doesn't mean that much. They made all these changes. He wrote to his friends, like any young child might do, don't you think my version is better than when they came up with it? They mutilated it. And for 9 years, he refused to let people know that he was the author. Later, when it became more popular, he was the author. But what happened was, in the night of July the 2nd, that is the night that they voted to be independent. Adams writes to his wife, Abigail, this will be the day we'll have fireworks forever. This will be the day we'll remember this forever, July the 2nd. So what happened? Well, on July the 2nd, 1777, they were still in the Continental Congress. They're worrying about the war. They forgot the date. So when they realized at the end of the day they forgot, they said, we got to get ready to celebrate. They actually got the celebration on July the 4th, the date that the document had been agreed to, not signed. It wasn't signed to August. And so for the ensuing 50 years, Jefferson and Adams kind of sparred over many different things. They had a lot of disputes and so forth. But Adams always resented the fact that July the 4th, which was associated with Jefferson, got the credit, and Jefferson always thought that Adams was not recognizing how great the document was. And they both died, as I think people know, 50 years to the day afterwards. July the 4th, 1826, Adams is on his deathbed and says, Jefferson still lives, but Jefferson had died a couple hours earlier. And people took that as a sign from Providence that these men had really done something great, because they both died on July the 4th, exactly the same day, 50 years to the day. One thing that's interesting about Jefferson is in his book is this. Some people have criticized Jefferson in recent years because he was a slave owner. And people say, well, why should we have a Jefferson Memorial? Or why should we have a Washington Monument? Because they were slave owners. And my own view on it has been, if you honor somebody that's a Confederate general precisely because he's a Confederate general, and that's the only reason, that might not be appropriate. But you have other reasons to honor people like Jefferson or Washington. In Jefferson's case, it's a very sad situation in some ways, and one of the things he's been criticized for is something that's in the book, and I'll just describe it briefly because it is kind of jaw-dropping when you think about it. Jefferson's wife died when Jefferson was 39 years old, and on her deathbed, she said, I had a stepmother. Promise me that you will not get married again. I don't want our two daughters to have a stepmother. So what are you supposed to say on your wife's deathbed? Yeah, okay, I'm not going to get married again. So of course he said it. So he said that, and he never did get married again. He went to Paris. He went to France as kind of an ambassador after the Revolutionary War was over, and he had his oldest daughter with him. His youngest daughter was then, when he went over, like 2 or 3 and too young to take over. But when she was about 9, he said, I want her over. So letters go back and forth, and finally it's arranged that somebody will bring over and escort the younger daughter. And the younger daughter is escorted over by a slave. And they go initially to see Abigail Adams, who's the wife of the ambassador, John Adams, to London. And Mrs. Adams writes to Jefferson, says, please come pick up your daughter. And Jefferson writes back, I'm too busy, can you send her to me? And Mrs. Adams was upset. Why don't you pick up your daughter, come here? But he didn't do that, they sent her over, and the slave lady took took Jefferson's daughter. Well, the slave that showed up, her name was Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old. The age of consent in Virginia at the time was 12. It had been raised from 10. And when he saw this woman who was 3/4 white, what did he see? He saw his wife. He'd never seen his wife as a teenager, but the reason he saw his wife was this. Martha, Thomas Jefferson's wife, father was John Wares, a prominent slave owner and plantation owner in Virginia. Like many white male plantation owners, he impregnated his slaves. One of the slaves he impregnated was Sally Hemings' mother. So when Jefferson saw Sally Hemings, he was seeing somebody that looked like his wife, and because they were in effect stepsisters. And he obviously was attracted to her, and he had a deal with her. If you come back with me to Virginia, where you'll be a slave, there's no slavery in Paris, she could have stayed there and been free, I will free any of our children. And they had 6 children together, 4 lived to adulthood, and he honored that. When he died, he freed them. 2 of them were so white-looking that they lived as whites in Ohio for the rest of their lives. He didn't free Sally Hemings. Why? Because Sally Hemings apparently wanted to stay in Virginia. And in those days, if a freed slave wanted to stay in the state in which they were being freed from, they had to get the approval of the state legislature, and Jefferson obviously didn't want the state legislature talking about his relationship with Sally Hemings, which was fairly well known. Anyway, more than you want to know about Thomas Jefferson.
The part about Jefferson, David, that's got me baffled. Well, actually, in your book, you write about him being able to walk to his inaugural with nobody, just get up and walk down the street.
No security.
No security, no cares.
And Adams can you believe this? Adams didn't stay for it. He was so mad, he left town before Jefferson could be sworn in. Can you imagine that happening?
Yeah. Well, and that what you touched on, what's useful about Jefferson is the writing, because he didn't give speeches, but he did the memo. So if you go to any meeting, whatever business you're in, if you're going to do the memo and start arguing off of the memo, in today's parlance, then you start getting your points passed. But the comeuppance for Jefferson was somebody started slashing it too much. But it does tell you the power of doing the work of writing still in any board meeting. You know, if they're negotiating off of your document, you have a better chance of getting things you want done than the brilliance of Adams' oratory.
Now, you have written a couple books about presidents and their environmental contributions. One was Teddy Roosevelt, one was Franklin Roosevelt, and one was Presidents Nixon forward. Why was Nixon such a great environmental president when people didn't think he would be? And why was FDR such a great environmental president when people didn't realize that he was that committed to that area?
You know, I always say about if you want to understand FDR, you study Theodore Roosevelt. You know, Theodore Roosevelt was a, New York, from New York, FDR, New York. Both of them went to Harvard. You know, they were state legislators in New York, governor of New York. Both, FDR became an assistant secretary of the Navy to follow in the wake of TR. And TR loved two things the most, really, which was big Navy and conservation. And FDR becomes big Navy and conservation. TR liked to shoot things. He liked to hunt. But also do the taxidermy and identify species, where FDR liked trees and tree planting. So Hyde Park, New York, if you go out there on the Hudson, it's actually a tree plantation. And he would send Christmas trees to Churchill from, every year or two, the, royalty in Europe. And FDR, as president, would do marketeering, taking out an ad in the New York Times saying, "Have a New Deal Christmas, buy a tree from Roosevelt Farms." Truly, you can look them up. He was a really into, and it reminds you that both of them loved, Eleanor Roosevelt tellingly said about FDR that they say Franklin's not an intellectual, but he has a map mind. And FDR's biggest skill, in my mind, it comes out of his postage stamps collecting, his spinning of the globe of geography. But he did know waterways and lakes and where the ports were and where natural resources were in a very astute way, and so did TR.
Right. Well, some of you may remember this. When Richard Nixon resigned, I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that, but you may remember the day the helicopter was waiting on the South Lawn, and he made a speech, and he said in that speech, "I asked my son-in-law, Edward Cox, to go get a book for me from the library." And he wanted to read from that book. And the book was a letter that Teddy Roosevelt had written, essentially. And the letter was written in an incredible situation. Some of you may not remember this, but Teddy Roosevelt was a state legislator, and he was not that well liked by other state legislators because he was rambunctious and he was really difficult to deal with, but he was a hard-charging guy. And he's at the state legislature one day, and he gets a telegram, "Come home immediately, your wife is very ill." And so he rushes back, he gets there. His wife had just given birth to Alice Roosevelt Longworth, later known as, and the mother has a kidney disease, I think it's called Bryce disease, and ultimately she dies. In the same house, within a couple hours, his mother dies. His mother was there as well. So can you imagine what it's like to lose your mother and your wife the same day in the same house? And then he writes this letter, basically, which Nixon quoted, saying, "The light has gone out from my life." Yeah. And he thought his life was over. He then moved out to the Badlands and kind of tried to reconstruct his life and became a cattleman. And then all of that happened well before anybody thought he'd be president of the United States. And so he came back from the depths of despair. It's an amazing story.
It is, and if you look at the diary, just seeing the X that he put on his diary, like, "My life is over," losing a mother and wife on the same day. But his sister had the insight to say, "Go west," because when he was in Harvard, his big gift was going way out to Carroll County, Iowa, to go grouse hunting. And it might sound Iowa, you think of corn or Des Moines, but look where Carroll County is, way western Iowa. There's very sparsely populated, and he wandered around there. And then he made his way to the Red River at Minnesota, and while there, ceremoniously, he put a buffalo robe around him, Theodore Roosevelt, and he was under the spell of Francis Parkman's book, Oregon Trail. about going west. And also TR, if you're looking at 1870s, 1880s, they were first time we were seeing photographs of natural features in the West in boys' magazines. And to get to Nixon, Roosevelt's conservation was a point of pride in the Republican Party that Nixon grew up with. TR saved 234 million acres. But add to that Nixon had to deal with California environmental-minded people a lot out there. And he always loved an oceanscape. He would, whether it was looking out at whales, he did legislation to protect whales, Nixon, the last thing you would think may matter to him. And he chose himself to give redwood sap when we got our pandas that you have restored. He has done more for our panda bears and when they're at the National Zoo than
pandas,
anybody.
They have some problems.
They do now.
But
we recognize.
For those who are familiar with the panda problem, they have the hardest, the most difficult reproductive system in the world of mammals. The female can reproduce really is fertile for about 4 hours a day, 1 day a year. So, you got to be there at the right time. And if you only do this 4 hours a day, 1 day a year, you don't know where the parts are supposed to go, and they fumble around a lot. It's complicated. But back to humans. It's been on the same subject. I'll mention Woodrow Wilson as an example, and Andrew Jackson are examples of two presidents whose reputations have gone down. Normally, presidents' reputations, scholars come along, they say they're better than you thought. Truman is a good example of that. When David McCullough wrote his book, all of a sudden people realized Truman was great. Carter's reputation, I think, is coming back a bit too. But two presidents' reputations gone down. Why has Jackson's gone down, for example?
I'll mention Jackson, but one last kicker on the panda bears. He's not really, he's telling you the absolute truth about how hard it is to breed with them. But Nixon decided to give them redwood trees. So we exchanged the redwood saplings to China as a gift to China.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so it was, he was sentimental more than people would think, Nixon, on some of this. And of course, he created the Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. It wasn't his bailiwick, don't get me wrong, but there was a little more sensitivity to clean air and water. Just being in LA, you couldn't breathe back then, But on Jackson, when I grew up, we considered him. I grew up in Ohio by Lake Erie, and we loved Oliver Hazard Perry and the Battle of Lake Erie. But then I moved down to New Orleans, where everything's about Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans, and he was a folk hero. Snuff boxes, cigar boxes, Jackson's face after winning the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And songs written about him, and he became seen as sort of the authentic American backwoods figure, military figure. Had all these hard-scrabbled stories about so-called Indian wars with Creek and Seminole and Choctaw. And then, of course, when he became president, he did a lot of things against institutions. He was a populist. But what's dragging him down in history most is Native American extermination, indigenous people, Trail of Tears, and that he seemed in his writings to take a kind of a glee at extermination or utter removal. Right. And so recently, most people are starting to look at him in a more critical light. However, in the MAGA movement, he has been adopted somewhat as a populist, swashbuckling kind of figure who blew up the establishment of its time. So it kind of depends on where you're at on the political spectrum. But academic historians, people who spend their lives, are starting to really look at him in a lower light.
Well, there used to be Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. There are no more Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners because Jackson's not as well liked. Another person in the same category is Wilson. Wilson was considered this great idealist, and I start the book by talking about how that's when people realized the President of the United States is the most important person in the world. When he went to Paris to help resolve World War I, it was the first time a President of the United States had left office while he was in office, and he went for 6 months in total. He was cheered by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Parisians, and people realized this is the man, a President of the United States who can solve our problems. And he was considered, when he was alive, and later for many, many years, a great president. What would happen more recently, though, is people realized that he had resegregated the federal workforce. The workforce in Washington was actually desegregated, integrated, and he was a son of the Deep South, really, and he wanted it to resegregate it. But secondly, he also lied to the American people and deceived them because he had a stroke with about 18 months to go, and he was basically bedridden, couldn't really do anything, never really told people how bad he was. His wife kind of covered it up, and it was thought to be really misleading the American people about how damaging he was. I'll tell you one story about him as well, some of you may appreciate, or maybe not. Wilson's wife died when he was in office in the first term. And so he was, despite his ascetic-looking image, he was quite a ladies' man, and he had a lot of dates. And then people were always wondering who he's going to date and who his next wife might be. So he finally gets fixed up with a date of a woman who was a jeweler, the widow of a jeweler in the Galt. Some of your jewelers buy jewelry in Washington. There was a famous jewelry store, Galt, G-A-L-T. And so the widow ultimately gets introduced to Wilson. Apparently they had a couple dates, and then people got excited about it, and the Washington Post broke the story saying that she was going to go to the White House one night, and the headline was supposed to be, President Wilson entertains at the White House Mrs. Galt. But they got screwed up in the writing, and it said, President Wilson enters Mrs. Galt at the White House, which may have been true, too.
I don't know what to say to that story. Your book does remind us when Wilson became a superstar after
Right.
He went to Versailles and all. He was like a global celebrity and really represented the power of the American presidency. But Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909 did enough things on civil rights oriented, like Booker T. Washington meeting at the White House and paying federal employees, if you were black, the same as whites. That was that arc of justice bending in the right direction. And Wilson gave it whiplash.
Who was the greatest president of them all?
Boy, Lincoln. I think you always have to pick Lincoln because, a remarkable story that we never tire of is learning about how he self-taught and his growing up in Indiana and Kentucky and becoming the person from the Midwest at the time, Illinois, at the time when Chicago was booming, but he was in Springfield, and how he wasn't really known. You deal with this in your book. People didn't even know. He interviewed a historian, Ted Widmer, but people have never met Lincoln a lot. He was briefly in Congress, but he was a non-entity, and he wasn't even on the ballot in many southern states. You couldn't even vote for him in 1860. He only won 39% of the vote because there are 4 candidates. Imagine you're coming in, you're not on the ballot in some states, and you only have 39% of your public. Yet today we look at Lincoln as adding to our foundational documents with Gettysburg Address and both inaugurals and of course the Emancipation Proclamation.
Look, I agree. He's the greatest president because he saved the Union. A lot of people in the North didn't really want to save the Union, say let the South go and they can go do what they want. But he saved the Union. He believed in the Union. He also did the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't something he wanted to do initially, but he did it, and it ultimately led to the 13th Amendment. But he also did all this with humility. You can't imagine him walking around the White House saying, I just won the Civil War. Hey, you know what? I wrote the Gettysburg Address all by myself. Can't imagine him doing that. And the Gettysburg Address, when you think about it, he didn't have Ted Sorensen write it. It was 272 words that describe what America is all about, better than any other 272 words we've ever seen. As we all probably know, he was an afterthought at that event. The great speaker of the day was a former president of Harvard, former senator from Massachusetts, and he was paid, I think, $20,000 to give a speech. Ultimately, they had to do it in November when he was free to do it. And as an afterthought, they invited Lincoln to make some remarks. And the other speaker spoke for about 2.5 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. And at the time, nobody really had a photo of him doing it because he kind of sat down before the photographers got up and were ready to photograph him. But that speech has lived on, and people all around the world memorized it. In fact, many young people in America used to memorize it. And when Jimmy Carter was doing the Camp David Accords with Sadat. They weren't getting very far, so Carter came up with the idea, let's take them to the Battle of Gettysburg and show them this great American sight. And they get there, all of a sudden, Begin recites the Gettysburg Address without missing a word, because he had memorized it, and he said it was the most impressive speech he'd ever seen. So the other great president, other people would say, is George Washington. So we should mention George Washington. Why was he a great president?
Because he was such a great general. And you know, when you look at Washington's strategy in the Revolutionary War, it's pretty amazing against all odds that he was able to prevail. Again, I think it's because he knew topography and geography. I was a land surveyor, so with our so-called ragtag Revolutionary Army, he knew where to cross a river, where to get wild strawberries, where the fishing was good. He understood you know, the famous, right now at West Point, they're trying to save the famous chains, or you can, you know, went across the Hudson to stop the British, because he knew the bend in the Hudson River, and the British were clumsy here. They may have had better uniforms and more provisions, but seemed to be, you know, a giant stuck in and so Washington kind of was a guerrilla fighter. Yet he was also the ultimate gentleman and person. And some people said he wasn't that smart. Even some of the founders, they were saying that until he entered the room, and then they would hush because
Well, he wasn't educated. I think he went to the second grade. He didn't have a formal education. He was originally going to go to England for education, and his father died. And he did two great things. He was the general of the war and won it, even though he lost more battles than he won. And then he was taken out of kind of retirement to preside over the Constitutional Convention. Had he not done it, the Constitution probably wouldn't have been agreed to, or certainly not ratified. But he didn't want to be President of the United States, did not. And the reason was no male member of his family had lived past the age of 50. And he was 57 at the time. But he agreed to do it, and ultimately he served 2 terms, and that was the tradition. 2 terms, and then you're done. Eventually we had a constitutional amendment to that effect.
In the fact that we're here sitting in Washington, D.C. with the Washington Monument, and we're having America 250. And the last thing I'll ask you, 250 years of the United States, what are you hoping comes out of America 250? And in the spirit of all you've done for this place, National Archives, Library of Congress, the Mall, you know, you name it, with your philanthropy and your caring about our past is just so awesome. Thank you.
Well,
and what you've done with the Kennedy Center also.
Thank you.
For
Thank
all
you. Thank you very much. So I hope that people will learn how to pronounce the word for the 250th anniversary. How many people can pronounce semi-quincentennial? That's the key. Semi-quincentennial. Okay.
Well, let's hope we all we're all celebrate that together. Thank you all for coming.
And
it's always
thank
great.
you.
The highest calling, get his book.
I would like to acknowledge our executive director, Patrick Madden. Patrick, stand up.
Thank you.
And we hope you'll become a member of the National Archives Foundation. Hear it again for David Rubenstein. David M. Rubenstein.
Thank you.
And thank you, Doug Brinkley.
Thank you, man.
Matt, how are you?
I was in New York one time.